but I didn't know what I was doing. And I worked for the company, and within 2 weeks, they put me on a plane to Hong Kong. And I called my dad in the middle of the night and I was crying. And I said, I have to present to the president tomorrow. And he said, you know, Amy, you may have interviewed up. So I'll never forget that.
If you have a business, you need a website. What's the best way to get a website up and running? By choosing a company that makes it simple, like Pair Networks. Pair has over 20 years of experiences managing the entire digital ecosystem for thousands of online businesses all around the world. Pair makes it really easy for you with do-it-yourself website building tools and features, including simple drag and drop page design. And they have guaranteed US-based support technicians ready to help you whenever you need it, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Right now, when you sign up with Pair Networks, you will receive 1 free month of web hosting. See for yourself how easy it is to build your website for free. That's pair.com/grace to get started today.
Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Grace.
So to start off the show, I wanted to know more about what are some experiences that you feel like were really matter to your career, but it was not really on your resume?
I think that's a really interesting question. And one of the things I think about with career is that your career is a reflection of you as a person and where you want to take your life, and different things that happen in your life end up shaping elements of your career. So I will say that it may sound very, very traditional, but my mother has been an inspiration for me. And the older I get, the more I understand about how she was a trailblazer as a woman in a career in the 50s. Mm-hmm. And I've asked her about how she had the confidence to do what she did. And she said she just never thought about it. She just did. So my mom sort of got out of Dodge as soon as she could. She was born in Boston and grew up in Maine. And she went to college. She went to Bennington College, which was all women. And she couldn't decide whether she should be a music major or a chemistry major. And she decided to be a music major, and she went on to get her master's in composition at Columbia, and she had her Fulbright in Germany. And then, you know, what career opportunities were there for a highly educated woman in the 50s? She became a secretary. She became a secretary to the president of Columbia Records, and quickly moved up. And her title was AR man. So she was basically a talent scout. She was a talent scout for Broadway shows. But how could you call, you know, Liz Larson an AR man? So they created the title producer for her.
Wow.
And so that, yeah, wow. So, and so I appreciated that story. The older I got, the more I appreciated that story. Mm-hmm. Because she was as we know, in many industries, when you think about, I always like, one of my favorite examples is think about how much cooking women do. Mm-hmm. And then think about who the top paid chefs are. And you could do that in almost everything. And I didn't mean for this to be standing on a feminist soapbox, but I will say that the oldest of 3 and a daughter, and I had this woman, so as soon as I was born, she quit working, but she found new work, and she worked as a composer. She became a performing pianist. She taught piano when I was growing up, and then taught college students, and it just kept on evolving her career. So I grew up with a very sort of entrepreneurial, creative woman who didn't really think about glass ceilings. She just did. So I would say that story is what affected me the most.
I'm curious, particularly when you were growing up, did she kind of train you in some specific ways, so you kind of adopt that no limitation style of thinking? Or do you feel like naturally she kind of just...
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I know that my parents together raised us to be independent. Yeah, I didn't really question things. And it wasn't until, fairly far along in my career that I started noticing, some things that we read about where, I never was aware about the disparity in pay, because those things were always not really talked about, but how women were treated. And I've worked in retail, which is very women dominated, but, I started working in the mid 80s, and, in retrospect, there were women up to a certain level, but the bosses were always men. I didn't really think about it. I just did my job. So I would say my experience was being raised to be independent, and also being raised by this woman who's intensely productive. So that's just how I approached everything. And there was balance in the household. My mom always said my dad was the sunshine in her life. So through my dad could connect with anyone. And I think that, I learned some of that from him, which I ended up bringing into, I know later on, we're going to talk about some things that, I've learned and developed, but connecting with people is something that I tapped into sort of later on in my career. So, sometimes it's hard to get too far from where we came from. And in my case, I feel fortunate.
When it comes to like shaping your own career, right? Like, did you always wanted to be like a executive at a makeup or clothing company, or like what were your ambition back then, and how did you kind of arrive at where you are?
Actually, my very early ambitions were to be in the medical field. And then when I learned about psychology, I became very interested. In fact, I was a psychology major. And but I went to business school, and I went into business. And at different points in my career where I've been at an inflection point, needed to decide, do I stay or do I go? I'm ready for the next thing. I've always turned to school and sort of human behavior as an answer. So in the 90s, there was a reorganization when I was at Gap, and I didn't really end up where I wanted to be and in a job that I wanted. I liked what I had been doing, not what I started doing. So I thought, this is a good time to sort of take an inventory. So I did get into school to become a marriage, family, child therapist. The leadership convinced me to defer, and they said, that job you were asking for, that strategy job, we're going to promote you into that, and we're going to give you more money. So just defer. So of course, defer turned into not go. And there are similar things that happened. So the one thing I knew is when I was in college and I was the psych major, and companies came to interview for jobs, something that I have always loved was shopping. I just could spend hours shopping. Hours. In fact, I made money just so I could shop because I loved to shop. And when I found out there were department stores coming to interview and I could get a job and work in a store, I thought that sounded like heaven. So that's how I got into retail.
I love it. Curious, like, what do you think is like one skill that you're constantly trying to get better at?
Political savvy, having the awareness of how things really get done in an organization by navigating personal/professional relationships in a way that enable you to get results done. It's not always straightforward what you need to do. It's usually clear, but not always, where the power sits in an organization, but it's not always clear how to influence. It's really political savvy to have influence when you're not the one in charge of making the decision. How do you put forward what you think is the right thing to do? How do you get people aligned with your vision when they don't report to you? They may have different experience. And sometimes it means you have to give up some of all those things for the bigger picture. But yeah, it's one of the hardest things is navigating organizations.
So that, like, there's a relevant question to that, which is like, who is on your personal board of advisors when it comes to career development? Is that going to be your parents, or do you think it's like someone at your work that you would bounce off ideas with?
It's changed over time. It's definitely not my parents. Well, my dad's no longer with us, and but even I don't know if my parents. They sort of get what I do, but not specifically understand what I do. I spent over 20 years at Gap, and while I was at Gap, I did find people I'd worked with whom I sort of adopted as sponsors and mentors to ask about the next move and if they would recommend me for the next move. And I moved when I was at Gap, it was so large that I was able to sort of propel myself sort of every 2 to 3 years, either to get promoted and or move to a different part of the company. So I'm very motivated by learning. And so some of those moves, I would consult with some of my, I would adopt internal advisors. There wasn't a formalized program, but there were a few key people I went to. And even after they left Gap or I left Gap, I would still turn to them and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. And then other people whom I may have, presented to, who were senior to me, who may have left the company, if I felt like I thought that they were wise, I would reach out to them and I'd say, I'd love your perspective on this, or especially if they had a connection to a company or a role that I was interested in, just to ask what they thought about it.
What do you think is your like unfair advantage / your unique strength that like your peers probably don't?
That's a tough question, because I think that there's really, it's very yin and yang. So what your strengths are, it also points to what your biggest opportunities are. I am very, very people-centric. And something that I love to do is develop talent. I've been told by people who are above me, who expect leaders to show up in a certain way. And if you show up in a certain way, you'll get better results. I've been told that I'm too soft, I'm a pushover, and I protect my people. And I feel like, if I have a team, I have people reporting into me, their successes are my successes and their mistakes are my mistakes and their opportunities are my opportunities. So I've been told, actually fairly recently, you need to market yourself. You need to be the one presenting. And I've always felt like, if the people who are working for me look great, it has to be a reflection on me, right? Because we've worked together and it's not like I'm sending them to the wolves unprepared. We've worked on things together and I want them to feel ownership and like they're adding value. And I've found that cultivates a lot of trust. And also I have people who would work for me no matter where I go. And it's because they know I'll always help develop them, work with them closely, provide enough direction without saying we have to do it my way, and also support them and help them get elevated and let their value come through. So I would say that that's one thing that I do very, very well that I don't see a lot of people spending time doing, but there is a flip side to it.
I definitely see what you're saying. Like if your employee are doing something good and then if they look good, basically you would look good too. Like when I'm like hiring like an intern or something, I would tell them if one day you got a job at Google, I would be really proud of you. Yeah. Like because of you're investing into people's life. And that's like a good reflection of you're picking look at people too. Curious, speaking of Gap, you mentioned that you worked there for like over 20 years, right? So how did you started in this whole retail ecosystem? Yes. And like how do you transform yourself from a store manager to someone work on corporate strategy?
Okay, so my very first job, I went through a retail training program with a department store in New York, and it was on the selling floor, and then I wanted buying experience, and they said, well, you didn't enter the buying program, you entered the store program. So I left to get buying experience, and I worked for Kids R Us. Mm-hmm. And then after about 2 years, I realized that I'd been working for a while and I felt like I didn't really understand financials and how the business all fit together. So I went to business school, and after business school, I tried consulting, and I didn't feel like I could authentically advise anyone because I hadn't worked for long enough. I felt like a fake. So I went back into retail and worked for May department stores and became a buyer at Lord & Taylor. And then I was recruited by Gap when they launched Old Navy. So my first job with them was as a merchant, and I was in charge of all of women's, they call it woven. So it was women's bottom. So it was basically jeans, pants, skirts, shorts, everything like that. And then shirts and jackets and things like that. And, but I didn't know what I was doing. And I worked for the company, and within 2 weeks, they put me on a plane to Hong Kong. And I called my dad in the middle of the night and I was crying. And I said, I have to present to the president tomorrow. And he said, Amy, you may have interviewed up. So I'll never forget that. I figured it out and worked my way around. So yeah, actually that strategy job, that's the story where I worked for Gap International as a merchant, and I was in charge of half of the women's products in 5 different markets. And like many companies, there's always a push-pull between centralizing and decentralizing. And so they centralized and they put the international division to the US division. And I did not like that job, and I did not like where I ended up, even though I'd gone to all my mentors and said, whatever you do, don't put me in that job. And they put me in that job. So I thought, all right, that's when I decided to go to school. And that's when they said, all right, that strategy job you wanted. So I really didn't know how to do strategy, but what I did do was I went market to market, and I put together a methodology. I had one person who worked with me. She's now at Stitch Fix, does a very big job. And we went market to market, and we did competitive and pricing analysis. So we brought back information to people who sat in San Francisco to help them understand their competitive set and their customer expectations and how we were showing up in the market. And from there, I did go into strategy. And then from there, I went back into the business. I went to work as a merchant running kids, baby, and maternity for Gap Outlet. I would say, I was just willing to learn. And when I transitioned in this strategy, there was a super smart marketer who had worked in consulting, and then she had worked in corporate strategy, and she moved into marketing. And so I sought her counsel on things. And a lot of the projects that you see on my resume having to do with, it was the old days, it was like Gap Body, what should they be? And Baby Gap, how do they be relevant? And Gap Kids, they're sort of stuck in the middle. I was on some cool projects, and we worked with agencies and a lot of market research. So it did open my eyes to different ways to think about the business. But I did seek the counsel of someone who rose up through the ranks in corporate strategy for information.
So basically, I see you're like taking the initiatives to kind of like do a career transition to position yourself in that light. I read on your resume, you identify like $150 million opportunity and develop a business plan. And then you kind of like took on 20 people to like execute on this plan.
Yes.
What were you doing back then when you were doing these like development? And what did you find when you were doing the market research? Did you went to every single store, or like, how did you do?
We had market share reports from a company called NPD. They're still existing today, and they still provide that information. So what was going on at that time is that outlets were booming, and we were Gap Outlet, and Gap brand was still pretty strong. So your outlet representation is, it really hinges on your brand equity. But the model was such that we would remake bestsellers, and then we would supplement and re-merchandise to pull everything together, because we wouldn't remake the bad sellers. So we couldn't copy what had been in Gap the prior year. So it wasn't runoffs and extra stuff. It was manufactured, and we would take Gap designs and we would manufacture them in basically Old Navy factories to get better pricing. And so I was running kids, baby, and maternity, and our business, the whole outlet business was strong, and the kids and baby business was the strongest part of the business. We just didn't have enough space. So we identified the upside if we removed the constraints of space in the store, how big the business could be based on trend and how fast things were selling out. And so the first thing we tried to do was get more space in the store by taking it from other areas. That didn't fly. So we put together a proposal to do standalone kids and baby outlets, which as a strategy to go get that market share made sense. The only thing that didn't make sense was that the execution, and by the time those shops opened, I'd moved into eCommerce, so I wasn't there, which was hard because it didn't, in the end, it didn't work. And for several reasons. One of the reasons is that there was no convenient real estate available in the outlets, because the outlets as a channel was booming and .com wasn't really a thing, and there wasn't a lot of competition. I mean, Target was not what it is today, and there wasn't, there wasn't a lot of competition. So we couldn't find adjacent spaces. So what mom and what family is going to go to the mall or go to the outlet center and go to one end for Gap and another end for kids and baby? So we opened the first, the real estate team found, 5 available spaces, but it wasn't convenient. They weren't great spaces, and they weren't necessarily the best malls either, or the best outlets. So yeah, it didn't work.
I think like that's like great that you guys even got the opportunity to try, right? Like to at the beginning, then like I think even at that point, it seems like you were early on in your career, and then you just transitioned from a merchandiser to working corporate strategy. And I feel like to convince people to give you the funding to give it a try, it says a lot about you, right? And
thank you. I did it with the team. I mean, it was a cross-functional team. It was pretty early in my career. And at the time, I actually was acting, I was a merchant. I was a senior director of kids, baby, and maternity, developing, a strategy and for growth and a test case for going after this $150 million. So people went for it. And you're right, we did invest, but, it's all in the details. So, it's a hard decision. Like, do you test it even if it's not ideal? Yeah. And then, within a few years, the industry and the channel penetration really shifted. So the outlets got tougher, Gap's business got worse, Gap outlet, which still was doing decent. Retail's very fluid. And I know that's one of your questions, but retail's very fluid and the pace continues. It's the customer who's really in the driver's seat. And so it was a robust attempt at capturing market share. It just, in the execution, it didn't really work.
The next step you took was you went on to work at Banana Republic, which is another brand under this like giant umbrella.
Yeah.
And you were, in the end, you were like the VP and general manager of global bananarepublic.com. So you were in charge of this online thing.
Yeah.
So you kind of like reposition yourself from a store person to like an online person. And then at that point, online business was kind of new. Like what was the transition like? And then how do you kind of like think of this online business in general?
It was a great move at the time. And actually the reason I got the job is because one of my mentors who had asked along the way, she was some person, I've worked for her, and then I would consult with her, and she gave me, different shots at jobs. She hired me again and again. I was sort of fortunate. I was one of her, her go-to people. She recommended me for the .com job, even though I had no .com experience. So, walking in, I knew about merchandising. I knew about assorting. I knew about managing things. I didn't know anything about selling things online. So I learned those things from my team. And pretty quickly, after having that job, I was the divisional merchandise manager of bananarepublic.com. And in those days, it was run very separately from the store business. Like, we would draft off them, but we found different things worked online, and we had a lot of leeway, and business was just growing. This is before there was a sort of a reset button in the economy. This is prior to that. So my boss got promoted, and so I was elevated to her job, and that's when I became the general manager. And so one of the hardest things was I ended up being the manager for people who had been my peers, and I didn't know what they did really. So I figured that out, and we became a very, very tight team. And I think in that transition, I learned how to knit together a collaborative team and leverage expertise without my ego getting in the way, thinking that I needed to know everything. And so I think that like career-wise was a very important transition. And then business got tough, and that taught me other things. And then business built up, and then we launched in different channels. And so by the end, I was leading a really large team. And, in retrospect, first I didn't have great examples to follow in my immediate periphery. But in retrospect, I could have done a lot better. Things were very complicated and moving fast, and we were running, 4 websites, and the team, we couldn't, we had to figure out what gets leveraged, what gets curated uniquely for each site. And the thing that I should have done is done a better job finding what unites us all across, to set high level vision, to keep people connected. Instead, people felt more attached to their individual parts of the business. So In later jobs, I learned how to do that, but you can always reflect back and say, hey, what could I have done better? And that was something that I could have done better in that job. But I mean, I did have that job for a long time, very long for me. I think I was there for almost 7 years. And then I was asked to move back to Old Navy and work for a fairly young president, Stefan Larson, who he wanted to relaunch the website. He wasn't pleased with how it was being run and what it looked like, and he wanted it to reflect his vision of the brand. So I actually learned from him the power of having a higher level vision, whether or not people agree to it or not, but uniting people under this common vision where, you may not agree or not, but everything you do has to ladder up to this vision. So I actually learned a lot working for him, as tough as it was.
So back to like the Banana Republic thing. So at that point, since like the internet was kind of new, and then especially online shopping was kind of new, and how did you quickly learn about like what works for the online business for the bananarepublic.com, and which part of the offline retail do you think was great to transform into like the online part of the business? And when you came to a job that's like really new, for example, right now, everyone's talking about Web3 and NFTs or like all of these like crazy new technology. And it's similar to, I assume, like when you started this bananarepublic.com, that period, like how would you navigate these kind of like learning journey at a new challenging job?
That's a big question. So, well, first, in navigating and leading and running that business, it's always the customer who leads you. And, because we were run as an independent division, there was plenty of money to invest in what at the time were new technologies. And there were a lot of creative thinkers who were not constrained to test things. And if they didn't work, they just didn't move forward. But it was very much test and learn, which goes on today, of course, but it was customer led and ways to think about how can we make this easier, better, faster. I don't know, remember now if they called him the president or the CEO of the direct division. He really is a very big thinker. I think his background was McKinsey for years, but he also had started up several companies and had some failures, but had some real wins. And he just had very broad understanding of where things were going to go, like 5 to 10 years out. And you just had to believe him that actually would happen. He was actually quite visionary. So working in that environment, and we were completely separate from the stores. And, he said, we're going to do our best. We're going to make you proud that we're part of your brand. We will not sacrifice any branding whatsoever, but everything else we're going to decide. We're going to decide what to buy. We're going to, promote it the way, we know is best. We're going to sell it the way we know is best. We will protect your branding and we will do everything else. So talk about political savvy. That's not a lot of political savvy, but he put up the numbers and he delivered the operating profits. So that he just bought his way to independence for a long time. So I was working in that environment. So it was an environment where people, really shared, and it was the beginning of everything. It was the beginning of, at least beginning of my understanding of, performance media and how you use search. There's just a lot of money being made. So there are a lot of resources. So it was a really fun time.
So when you were thinking about Old Navy or when you were thinking about Banana Republic, although they're under the same umbrella, but they're kind of like really different in a way, like they're targeting really different target audience. When you first walk into a job in a leadership position, what would be your first day like? And how do you quickly understand the organization? And when you mentioned about like the political savvy, right? Like when you walk into a job, how do you understand the dynamic between key people within the organization and like what they're drived by and stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to answer that question, but with a different example from my time at Gap, because I was there for so long. So I knew a lot of people. When I left Old Navy and I joined Kendo, So Kendo is a beauty brand incubator, and it's
Mhm.
owned by LVMH, and it did many of the people who work there, not as many today, but when it first started, they spun off from Sephora, and it was a private label arm of Sephora. And, like Fenty Beauty is one of their brands, which is huge, and then they have a portfolio of brands. When I moved to that company, I actually read several books on like your first 100 days, your 90-day plan. And some were funny to me because one of them used a former CEO of Gap, and I like, oh no, that's not actually what happened. So I put together my own approach, and it really involves interviewing a lot of people and asking them all the same questions and figuring out the themes and asking some very direct questions about, like, because I went in as their first head of digital. And these are people who are running individual brands. So what is one person running digital across all of their brands? How would I get them to trust me? So I did ask questions, and these were some of the recommendations is, what's your greatest fear about me coming into this role? Or what would success look like in this role? But I also asked about a lot of other things, like how people work together, how they envisioned us partnering together, what the value add was of branded websites. And so I would say that as much as you can listen and not make decisions, like the guidance of starting a transition to a new role always is, you want to make some small decisions that you're right about early on meaning in the first 2 months, but hold off anything that's sort of a big decision for at least 3. And that's not always possible. Like the role I stepped into last December with the partnership with Sephora and Kohls, fortunately for me, there was someone who was already there who was part of the deal making process. And so I was able to lean heavily on her expertise and knowing what was going on. But I did have to help make some big decisions, which all had to do with the construction of our organization. So, but yeah, in general, you don't want to make big decisions because it's too easy to be wrong. And then, get rid of that person. Their first big decision's wrong. But also, you don't have a track record. You don't really know what's going on. And so you need to build those relationships and make sure, it's basically you need to know what you're doing to a certain degree before you start making decisions.
Yeah, I love that. I'm curious, when you were working at Kendo Brands, so you mentioned it's like a incubator for Sephora at the beginning. I mean, when I read their website, I feel like they're legendary. They have Marc Jacobs, they have Kat Von D, they have like you said, Fenty Beauty, which is really iconic now.
Yeah.
What was your thought process like when you were joining like something form that's really new? I know it's like started by the CEO of Sephora before.
Yeah.
When you guys started this private labeling division, like what were some KPIs that were drive in this? And then it sounds like a startup environment to me. What was it like there? And then why doesn't Sephora make them like in-house?
Well, I came in after, they were already started up. They were about to launch Fenty. They had Ulla Henriksen, Bite Beauty, Kat Von D, and Marc Jacobs. And so I came in, it's just that their own branded sites were very, very small, but they knew they had the opportunity to make money and deliver more branding and bring in new customers. So they wanted someone to run that business. So that's why they brought me in. Yeah, it was startup-y, but not, because it's beauty and it's prestige and it's LVMH and it was well-funded. And the reason they separated from Sephora is because the model, instead of in and out fashion collaborations, they created persistent brands. So they needed the space to grow, although at the time, those brands were all sold exclusively, almost 100%, but mostly exclusively through Sephora, which is Sephora's model is like they have, they do have broadly distributed brands, but what they're known for are things you can only get at Sephora.
Now, now your role is in charge of Sephora at Kohls. So like the partnership side, and then like you guys are, I believe, are gonna launch like 850 store by 2023. That's
Yeah.
super ambitious. That's
Mhm.
like basically every day you're launching 8 or 2 store.
Well, we have 200 open so far in the first year.
Right. That's already crazy. And then curious, like when it comes to launching these stores, what is it like? And especially during the pandemic, everything is so in half shutdown mode. What are some challenging things you guys are facing when it comes to like launching physical stores?
Well, fortunately, I mean, the challenges have been met. One challenge that presented itself, but in the end, like I said, the challenge was met, was hiring people to work in our shops with enough time to train them. And because there was a lot, people had to learn elements of Kohl's operations, and they're Kohl's employees. They had to learn the Sephora selling model. They had to learn all the product. They had to learn how to sell the product, the difference between the brands. And so that was a lot of information. And then the shops in Kohl's look just like a Sephora store, a new Sephora store. So they are very complicated. And so we also had to give time to set everything up. So I would say just the lead times were complicated, but the teams were, operationally incredibly sound and very good at what they do. And so, there was nothing that caused a delay. There are some supply chain issues, but nothing that's really impacted the business. So when you asked about KPIs, of course, we look at, sales and sales per square foot and profitability like everybody else.
I guess like when the partnership happened, I read it from like the news or like just like watch like YouTube videos about like a partnership like this. So Kohls and Sephora both will have like some sort of like point system. So when you purchase a Sephora product, you get some Kohls points.
Oh, the loyalty. Yeah,
The
it's
loyalty point.
Yeah. So Sephora its loyalty program is called Beauty
Mhm.
Insider, and then there's Kohl's Rewards.
When you guys are thinking about like a partnership like this, how is a decision like this being made? Since like those are involving with like two giant
Yeah.
retail empires, but in general, just like how do each party think about like, what could bring to the table as well as like get from it? And then like how is a deal like this to be like facilitated?
Well, I wasn't part of the deal, but in any partnership, each partner has to feel like there's, what's in it for me.
Mhm.
So this is the beauty business for Kohl's. It's a true beauty business. Kohl's sold beauty, but a lot of it was, well, half of it was fragrance, and then a lot of it was appliances and some makeup. But this is a full on, 2,200 square foot size shop full of prestige beauty. And for both companies, it's access to new customers. So, so there has to be enough of a, seen win in order to do a partnership. And then for it to work, the partners have to feel aligned with values and approach to the business and how the business will be run, and knowing that people can get along, because you have to get along to run a business together,
Mhm.
and have clear lines of where decisions are made and respect around different, the expertise both partners bring.
When you guys thinking about like launching this many stores, like do you have a strategy on like we're gonna launch like a 200 location in those 5 states or something? Like what are like the thinking logic behind it when you're like testing if a concept is like doable for the business?
I would say it's a pretty complicated set of decisions, but something like this, especially if you want it to work well, you want to put it somewhere where you believe there's enough demand, so
Mhm.
you'll be able to hit your financial objectives.
Yeah. So right now, getting like a product into Sephora is basically every like makeup retailer's dream. What are some bars and barriers that you guys use to like kind of select these products, as well as when you're opening these stores at Kohl's? Curious like what does it take to get a product into the store? And then I watched like the previous talk by the previous CEO of Sephora. Essentially different locations are like managed by different like buyers, or like they may have different products. When it comes to like product strategies, do you guys come up with like different things in different area? How do you kind of like plan these things?
Sephora is global. So in terms of different products in different locations, Sephora in the Middle East may have some different things from Sephora in Canada versus Sephora in Mexico. And in terms of getting product into Sephora, the Sephora merchants are really brand and product curators. So it depends on what the offer is, where the white space is in the assortment, and what's trending. So, it's art and science.
Yeah. When you think about now, like a lot of people, instead of opening stores, they're like selling online. What are some benefits in like the physical retail and, to create like a experience driven shopping environment?
Most people would prefer to buy things in store if they knew they could always find what they were looking for. And you have the advantage of having someone who can help you. And you also have the advantage of seeing what this thing actually looks like on you. Because there are a lot of tools online to try to help you filter and find the right thing. But it's still, there's some risk, and there's less risk if you're actually experiencing it live.
For sure. What's like a typical day for you at work in Sephora?
Oh, I'm in Zooms from like 8:30 until 5. I'm in a lot of different meetings because I interact with a cross-functional team and across 2 partners.
When you first like entered like Sephora, what was like your first day at work like back in time in 2018, I believe?
Oh, yes. So my first job at Sephora is I was the general manager for Sephora inside JCPenney. And I think my first day I spent getting to know all my direct reports and starting to learn about the product. So it was a really fun day. Yeah.
So when you were thinking about like the future of retail, do you think like the stores are going to be like a more experimental place, or do you think stores are still going to drive like the major amount of like sales?
Well, it depends on how many stores you have, but I think that, it depends. It could be 50-50. Yeah, it just depends on the retailer. Also, with all of the omnichannel offerings and trying to be fluid with inventory and just getting that customer what they want in the fastest way possible, it could be a 50-50 situation, 50% from online, 50% from stores. There's more money to be made through online operations because you're not paying for things like rent and all those people to run the store. But I don't think stores will ever go away. That would be a very tough transition. I know there's a trend right now in the marketplace where, Wall Street is pressuring retailers to spin off their .com into another company because it's more profitable. But there are a lot of problems with that, just in terms of the inventory ownership and management and organizations, and you lose all the leverage. And so anyway, from a financial perspective, I don't think they'll break apart. And from a customer perspective, online can be very convenient, especially if you're replacing something you already know about. But I think that stores won't go to, there've been different experiments that were pretty cool, like bonobos and other like showroom types of environments. But just like, many D2C small companies find that they get to a certain scale and they have to have stores. People want to live and breathe that brand and understand what it is and the quality. To get to a certain scale, you need both.
A physical location is like definitely extremely important, especially trying on makeup, like feeling the product on your skin, and instead of, I guess, like doing a lot of like research online. So we're at the last part of the interview. I have like a 1-minute short fire round for you. First question is like, what's your favorite book?
Well, the favorite book I've read in the past year is Isabel Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns, which is, I think it took her 15 years to research and write it's the story of the great migration of Black people in this country from South to industrial areas. And so she traces 4 people and their families and what happens. And it was eye-opening.
Wow. Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Well, I think I started with that. I would say my mom, because she's my role model.
Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Okay, right now I'm reading Clint Smith's How the Word is Passed, and I'm also listening to it on audio. So I'm doing a combination, like I'm listening and then I read and vice versa. And I would love to sit down and talk to him and hear him speak live.
Where can we find you outside of work?
Oh, often outside. I love to hike I love to ski. I love to just walk around neighborhoods. I'm in Northern California or at the Pilates studio or in the kitchen. I love to cook.
What would you cook?
I'm a baker.
Okay.
You know, like many people, I've learned to perfect sourdough bread. And
Oh,
as a
wow.
matter of fact, I'm going to be making some loaves, getting them ready to bake tomorrow. I'm doing that tonight. And but I'm a very good cookie cake maker.
I love that. What's your favorite brand at Sephora?
Well, I have some new favorites, but I'm still getting to know them. So I'll tell you one of my old favorites is Tatcha, which
I
is,
love Tatcha.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Beautiful skincare.
The silk cream or something. It's like
Yes.
the buttercream.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everything's beautiful. Tatcha is a beautiful brand.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for coming
Yeah,
on the show
please.
today.
Of course. My pleasure.